Welcome back again. This is the third part of what I thought was going to be a two-part series. I ran out of little time to talk about the last and final example, which is exercise 3. We're dealing with a function here, f of x, or the input of x, gives us the output of the square root of x minus 2. Notice we don't know what the inputs are and we don't know what the outputs are. We want to evaluate or find the value of the function for several values of x. The fastest way to do that will again be with a spreadsheet. And what subset of the real numbers would represent the domain being the input of the function, and what subset of real numbers would represent its range or the output of the function. And in order to experiment with a lot of values really quickly, a spreadsheet is incredibly helpful. In fact, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to do -5, -4, and then I'm going to do all the values from there to, like, let's say +5, but if I want to pull down. And then I'm going to evaluate the outputs for the square root of a4 minus 2. Error. The function square root parameter value 1 is negative. It should be positive or 0. What does that mean? Let's see what happens as we pull this down. All of a sudden at 2, I start to get a value. So I have to begin to think about what that means in terms of a square root. If I put in, let's just write it out very casually. If I try to evaluate the square root of -5, substituting -5 in for -2, minus 2, it's almost like I'm trying to evaluate the square root of -7. And as far as we know, a negative number can't have a square root, because if it's positive, if the square root is positive, a positive times a positive is positive. And if the square root is negative, well, then a negative times a negative is negative. So if it can't be positive, it can't be negative, and 0 times 0 is 0. There's no number that makes sense for the square root of -7, which means that until my input creates 0 or a positive number, literally it doesn't exist. And I also want you to know all my outputs create positive numbers too, which means when I begin to think about the domain or the input, my intuition has to say the input has to make a positive number under the square root, which means x minus 2 has to be greater than 0, or if we simplify that, x has to be greater than 2. So the domain only exists for values, all values greater than or equal to 2. On the other hand, the range only seems to output positive numbers. Because if I think about it, is there any way to get a negative square root? Not really, because we always take numbers and 0. We always take the positive, or what's called the real square root of that. In our next unit, we'll talk about, is it possible to have a negative square root in more detail? All right, in class today, we're going to be looking at the individual practice and evaluating functions as we have here. Then we're going to talk about substituting in different letters, as well as talking about a suitable domain and range for each of these functions right here. Looking forward to seeing you in class. Have a wonderful rest of your day.